when I was a kid, but I always wondered, what is wrong with us? If you say, we have to grow this to feed the world, and then it turns out it's not really feeding anyone, then
It's
you
feeding
see,
1%. It's like,
okay, so what is going on here then? I think we need a new economic system to birth this new story and this new world. We can get our staple foods, flowers and milks and oils from trees. And a lot of us just don't realize that.
Welcome to a new episode of the Food Forest podcast. And today we have with us Elspeth Hay, who is at this moment in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, United States of America. She's a host of the long-running public radio segment called The Local Food Report and has written a book with an amazing title, Feed Us with Trees, Please. Welcome, Elspeth. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a good morning for a little tea and chat.
Oh, yeah. It definitely is. We're going to talk about plants. We're going to talk about eating plants. 99% of nature is perennial plants, yet we eat 99% of our diet, like almost annuals. There's a big discrepancy between what nature normally would provide us and with what we eat. So you've written a book called Feed Us with Trees. If you had to say in one sentence, what is that book about? And also, why did you write that book?
I wrote that book because I've always felt like our species didn't fit into our ecosystems the way that other species do. And that's not true. And the missing piece for a lot of us in the Northern Hemisphere is that we can get our staple foods, flowers and milks and oils from trees. And a lot of us just don't realize that. So I wanted to share that once I learned it.
You also write about Indigenous wisdom. I suppose you also talk about the acorns?
Oh, yes. Lots about acorns. I had no idea that acorns are edible until a friend sent me a link to a TEDx talk from a woman in Greece, Marcy Mayer.
Oh, yeah. She makes amazing cookies.
Yes, she's amazing. She said that acorns are edible, and not just edible, but actually a superfood and one of our oldest human foods. And so that got me interested, and I went very deep down the tree nut rabbit hole from there, and did get to spend some time in California with an Indigenous man named Ron Reed, who is part of the Karuk tribe. And his people have eaten acorns since time immemorial for thousands and thousands of years. And so learned a lot from him about not just eating acorns, but how living in relationship with these trees can actually kind of change our perception of what our role is in our ecosystems as humans. And so that was really, really eye-opening for me.
You grew up in a family of birdwatchers in Maine. Did that affect the path you chose to trees? Because trees, they go very well together.
Yes, they do. It definitely affected my path. I don't think I realized it at the time, but I spent a lot of time with my parents and my sister as a kid, traveling all over the state of Maine. And we were always going to these different habitats. We would go to the mountains, and we would go out to these rocky islands in the Atlantic, and we would go to sort of more field areas. And everywhere we went, there were all these bird species that fit perfectly into the ecosystems. They all were able to meet all their food needs in these ecosystems. They could build their homes in these ecosystems. And then on the way home, we would stop at the grocery store. And as I got older, I learned more about where the food in the grocery store comes from. And it was these huge industrial farms that were destroying the exact types of ecosystems that I had seen these birds thriving in. And I don't think I could have articulated it when I was a kid, but I always wondered, what is wrong with us? Why don't we fit into our places the same way that all these other species do? It kind of felt like we were the only species that didn't fit in, we didn't have a habitat. And when I started learning about acorns and the really ancient human relationship between not just with oaks, but also chestnuts and hazelnuts and walnuts and some of these other nut trees, I started to see, wait, okay, we do have a habitat. And not just one, there's lots of different human habitats that we can make work. But that is sort of the main one where I've always lived in New England. And that was really exciting to start to feel like maybe we do fit and maybe some of us have just forgotten what our role is and how to play that role on the landscape.
Do you have an answer to the question, why are we out of place?
I think that a lot of it has to do with the history of colonization and sort of displacement. You know, we talk a lot, at least in the US, about being a nation of immigrants and people coming from many different places, but we don't actually often talk very much about why the many people of European heritage who live here today, why those people were leaving Europe. And there was this internal colonization of a lot of areas before that movement spread outwards and before Europeans started colonizing other places. And there's a lot of really hard history there that we don't really like to look too deeply at. And I think it involved a lot of ripping people apart from place and separating people from places that they had had very intimate relationships with for a long time. And I think that in the US, at least, we're in this moment of a lot of those tensions really coming to the surface and needing to deal with that history. So I think it's really important. And I don't think we're going to be able to heal our relationship with the ecosystems where we live until we can address that and talk about it.
Do you think is the first step that we need to take to become more in place?
Well, beyond the sort of inner work, which I do think is an important first step to being receptive to sort of some of the lessons of place, I think that one of the most powerful things that we can do to reconnect with the ecosystems where we live is begin to understand what the other keystone species are. So a keystone species is one that's as important to its ecosystem as a keystone in a Roman arch, right? If you take that out, the whole thing collapses, it falls apart. And there's lots of different examples and lots of different types of keystone species. It could be a plant that provides a lot of habitat and food for other species. That's where an oak tree or some of these woody plants would be a perfect example. It could be a shark, right, which is a predator. And if you lose the predators, then the prey populations get out of control. There's keystone species like bees, which are mutualists. And then there's animals like beavers, right, which they're cutting and damming and creating all this habitat. And that's actually the category that we fall into. We're what's called an ecosystem engineer. And, you know, right now we hear a lot about the negative ways that we engineer ecosystems, but we're actually capable of a lot of good too. And traditionally we've done a lot of our work with fire in a lot of places. So I think that anytime we're getting to know the other keystone species in our area and learning what they need and how we can support them as ecosystem engineers, automatically, if you are supporting keystone species, you are creating more life in your ecosystem, right? A lot of times today we're decreasing biodiversity, decreasing habitat, but anytime we're supporting those keystone species, we are bringing more life into our communities. And that's really important work.
You live at the most northeastern state of the United States. What's the keystone species over there?
So in our forests, I would say oaks. They're the most important for insects that we have here. But I live in a really interesting place because we're this tiny sand spit that goes all the way out 90 miles into the Atlantic. So, and very thin. It's only about, I guess, like 2 miles wide where I live. So very skinny little piece of land. So we have a lot of really interesting water species happening too.
Mm.
We have herring, which are a really important bait fish. And those have really been having a hard time. And there's a lot of work being done right now to bring them back. Sharks as predators. I could go on for a long time because there's lots of different examples. But in our woodlands, I would say oaks are our most important tree by far.
Yeah. You practiced storytelling for the last 15 years. I often hear that the crisis we are facing is not a climate crisis, it's not a biodiversity crisis, but an imagination crisis or a storytelling crisis. Is that so?
I think there's some truth to that. I had an experience before I had actually started the book, but right around the same time as I was starting to learn about some of these woodland species and the abundance that they can offer, where I I had all this back pain and I had it forever. And my mom had always had back pain. And I kind of had this story in my head that I just had this genetic issue with my back. And, maybe I could make it a little better or a little worse, but I wasn't really going to change things much. And I went to a new physical therapy place and they said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with your back." And I said, "What?" I said, "Oh, we could do an MRI of everyone on the street and lots of people would have the same thing as you, but it's just a herniated disc, but they wouldn't have any pain at all. It's just that you're afraid to use your back. And so now your muscles are weak. And so now you're in pain." And that was a new story to me. That was not the story that I had been told by my family. This was completely new. And within about 2 or 3 weeks, all that back pain that I had had my whole life was gone. And it was just because of a new story. And that, even though I was a storyteller, I think that having that experience really opened my eyes to the power of our stories and how much we can be unknowingly trapped inside them and working from a very limiting set of beliefs. And I do think that in the food realm, a lot of us live in this story that I call no farms, no food. And it's this idea that we don't have a habitat in the natural world. There's something sort of wrong with us and we're so unnatural that actually the world out there would be better off without us. And that's really just a story. That's not an ecological fact. There's people all over the world who are living proof that that is not true and doesn't have to be true. But one of the things about stories is that when we believe them, we often make them come true with our actions. And so I think that to me, that's a really important story to break down and try to tell a new one, which is why I wrote, a big part of why I wrote the book.
Yeah, and you often see that people are telling the story, oh, we all need to go and live in the cities because it's way more sustainable. Your transportation is much more functional, stuff like that. But we see it happening for example, in Belgium, where I'm from, or other places in Europe, other places in the world, and people get so disconnected from the land. It's like you and me and a lot of the listeners probably live closer to the land, so they kind of have the feeling with the land. But and we might not, we might understand it, but people who live in the city, they don't understand that. Like if the cord is ripped, they're helpless. They don't have any food. You can't really survive with millions of people of like one little park and eat the leaves from that park. And the same with the ecological services that little plants in the city are there. They kind of provide everything we need. And I'm wondering, the story we're telling right now, it's like you had experience with the story of your back. You got them started to believe in a new story.
Yeah.
What do you think the new story of what we are trying to achieve needs to be? How do we write that story?
I think that it's emerging in so many different ways right now. I think that part of this sort of no farms, no food story that a lot of us live inside is this story of scarcity, right? It's this belief that the world is scarce and we are in competition for limited resources and life is sort of this game of musical chairs. And so you have to be a winner. Otherwise, you're going to have nothing to eat. And the way that story is told, we tell it as though that's an ecological or a biological fact. And I think really where that story comes from, I actually did a lot of research to try to understand, how did we write this no farms, no food story? If it isn't just fact, where did it come from? And it was written at the same time as sort of very early capitalism and colonialism were getting going. And it was written during the enclosures in England, which spread all over Europe to a lot of different places where lands that had been common and owned publicly and held collectively and managed collectively were being privatized. And so there was this big push by the people doing the privatization to convince people that, oh, you're not losing much anyways, right? Those lands aren't that productive. You never really got anything from them. So no big deal if you don't have access to them anymore. And there was, I'm not going to remember, Arthur Young. Arthur Young was his name, this English orator who became quite well known and went all over the country, basically telling this story. And at the time, nobody really believed him because they had had access to these lands for generations and they knew exactly how productive they were and what they were losing. But what happens is a few generations down the line, the story starts to become more and more believable as you don't have a relationship with that place. You don't know, was it productive? Was I getting anything from it? You know, we're not sure anymore. And so I think that the further that many of us have become removed from local landscapes and their productivity and just the way they work, right? The little intricate things that make them tick, that story that, oh, there's no food for us in the wild and we have to carve out these farms and farms are so much more abundant, that story has just been told again and again and again to the point where most people don't even know to question it. And it's
Interesting.
pretty powerful. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of work to do, I think. I think the new story, sorry, I guess I didn't answer your question. I went on about the old story.
No, but it's good to see that perspective too.
Well, and the new story, I think, is I've been trying to go into any conversation about a plant or an ecosystem thinking like, I'm going to assume that I can be a force for good. I can have a positive relationship with this species or this ecosystem, that I have something great to offer. And what happens if we go into any relationship with a place assuming that, instead of assuming that we're a drain on it and that there's not enough and we can't make it work.
So we need a lot of Arthur Youngs
But with a new
telling
story.
that news story. Yeah. Telling we need to eat more trees.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read any of Octavia Butler's books. There's sort
No?
of these dystopian novels, and I believe she was writing in the 90s. But
Yeah, I heard about her. Yeah. But I haven't read
yeah,
it.
a lot of them, people are eating acorns, and there's sort of this societal crisis. So that's sort of a dystopian version of what could happen. But I think there's a lot of storytellers right now trying to sort of birth this new story collectively.
Yeah. Every story has also difficult chapters. What were difficult chapters in your journey of the last 15 years? Were there moments of failure or disillusionment?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that I had when I was trying to sort of shift from this old story that I had inherited to the new ideas that people were sharing with me was around this idea of yield and productivity. I had always been told and always learned, well, we have to farm this way because we used to be hunter-gatherers, but that is only possible when you're just a few people on a large area of land. And as things get more concentrated, people have to turn to farming. It's happened all over the world.
You have to feed the world.
Exactly. American farms are feeding the world. That is just was drilled into me as a kid. And as I got to know Ron Reed, the man I mentioned earlier in California, I learned a lot about the history of the sort of food targeted genocide in North America that was started by early colonial European settlers and then has really been actually become a program of the American government, where if people did not conform to the sort of grain-based row crop farming system, then they were killed, their land was taken, and
Were killed.
there's
God.
a really, really ugly history there.
Do monoculture or die, basically.
Yeah, sorry. And that's, if you look at the history of genocide against Indigenous people here, so much of it has been food focused. And, there's the outright violence, but then there's also this sort of more insidious violence of conform or starve. And so there was, I don't know if you've heard of the allotment system, but that was enacted here in the 70s, I believe was the date, where Indigenous people had land set aside, right? Reservation areas. And they had been managing that land in traditional ways, the way that they wanted to as a community. But then the government said, no, you have to parcel it into individually owned pieces of land, and you have to farm it the way that our government agents say you're going to farm it. And if you don't do that, then we're going to take the land away. And that, came on the heels of trying to kill all of the bison, the buffalo, which was a huge indigenous food source. It also came along with, we're going to clear all these forest areas that are full of food and convert them to fields. It was just this constant, relentless assault on these indigenous food production methods. And so it's very ingrained in American policy. And even if you look today, we subsidize corn and soybean farming. I believe the number is, I don't want to get it wrong, but it's in the billions of dollars. And then we say, oh, well, those are the most economic crops to grow, right? Well, not really. I mean,
Not
we're
really.
we're making it that way because they're taking all the tax money, but it's not just this that, oh, those are inherently more productive or those produce more food per acre. That's actually not true. And that was a really hard, hard story in terms of both hard to learn that really difficult history and also hard to get my mind to accept, wow, this thing that I have just been told repeatedly about American farms feeding the world, it's just not true no matter which way you look at it. And you can look at calories per acre, you can look at just productivity per acre, you can, however you look at it, it's a myth, and yet it's so ingrained. And so I spent a lot of time trying to sort of get over that hurdle mentally.
How did you finally get over it?
One of the real turning moments was a conversation with this really interesting agronomist, Ricardo Salvador. And he reminded me that yield is a ratio, right? So when we talk about yield on a farm, we're usually just talking about what we're getting out of a piece of land.
Uh-huh.
But he reminded me that it's what you're getting out that's on top, right? And then underneath is what you're putting in. And, once you do that math, that's your yield. And when you include all the other land that these farms are using kind of behind the scenes for seed production, for fertilizer production, for fossil fuel production and extraction, it's not more efficient at all. That's just a total lie.
It's distorted.
And if land really is this limiting factor, right, for how we're going to feed the world, then we definitely need to count all the land that we're using. Otherwise, this yield number means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and that's so true. And when you tell people that story, that fact, how do people react to it? Because like you say, we're been ingrained with how important it is to feed the world. If you, for example, talk to government officials or other high placed people and you state those facts, how do they react to you?
Well, often people, I think one thing that's really interesting about the yield conversation is it will start out as like a biological or not ecosystem, but sort of ecological conversation, right? Like, no, this yields more, right? And that's an ecology conversation. What can the land produce? But then as soon as you point out that the ecological part of the argument is not true and doesn't work at all, then people immediately shift over and they say, oh, well, it has to be that way because of the economy and that's just what's economical. And so it's this shifting target. You start with ecology, and then when that breaks down, it's like you go to the safety point of, oh, well, economics. And
the cards are shuffled this way, so let's just play the game.
Yeah. I do think, though, that one thing that is very hard for anyone to refute is when you look at the corn that we grow in the US and you break it down where it's going, this idea that we have to feed the world with it really doesn't hold up, because about 40% of it is used to make ethanol, and another roughly 45%, it says almost 45%, is used to feed animals that would do better on the natural ecosystems of the Midwest, right, on oak savanna or pasture. And they get sick from it and it causes all these problems. And then the other 15% is exported to other countries where it depresses local agricultural economies and wreaks havoc on their food systems. So that leaves less than 1% that's feeding American human bodies. And that's just a terrible argument for needing to grow it to feed the world. It doesn't. And I think that that's something that people can really understand, because if you say, we have to grow this to feed the world, and then it turns out it's not really feeding anyone, then you
feeding
see
1%. It's like,
okay, so what is going on here? There must be something else at play.
Yeah. You researched a lot for your book. What historical or indigenous tree food tradition surprised you the most?
Surprised? Well, I don't know what surprised me the most, but it was just so exciting to talk with people all over Europe and North America and learn how similar and overlapping so many of these traditions are. I have a really dear friend in Switzerland who comes to Cape Cod in the summer, and I got to go visit her in Bregalia, which is in the Alps in Switzerland. And they have this really ancient chestnut system there where I think that the Romans brought the trees, I believe, is the local story. And they are all over the mountainous area. I mean, these are mountains where talk about not a good place to grow grains, right? I mean, they're 12,000-foot peaks and they're extremely
Yeah,
rocky and jagged, but they have these chestnut huts where they smoke and dry the nuts. And people have eaten chestnuts as
beautiful.
a
Eh?
staple food there forever. And they have this beautiful chestnut-based cuisine with chestnut gnocchi and so many different ways of pasta and breads and desserts, and also chestnut-fed animals and their milk and meat and cheese. And so it was really cool to be there and then also spend some time in Corsica where they had a very similar system.
Mm.
And then to go through Appalachia in the US, where our American chestnut trees here have been decimated by the chestnut blight, which is a fungal blight that was introduced in the early 1900s. But to learn about the history there and how similar it was to some of these European places where, it's ongoing and still happening today. There were stories of people who paid almost all of their bills for the year by picking up chestnuts in the fall and bringing them to these, little post office general stores where they would ship them into the cities. It was just this incredible economic and food abundance. It provided so much for people. And, that's true of a lot of these nut trees in a lot of places. And hearing people talk about these systems and how carefully considered they were and how, thoughtful people have been about the trees and making sure that these trees are thriving and surviving wherever possible. It was really inspiring.
What did you learn in Corsica? I heard that people were forced to plant chestnut trees in the 60s.
Yeah, Corsica has a really interesting story because at first the indigenous population did not really have a big relationship with chestnut trees, and they were forced by Italian and I think maybe French colonizers to plant these trees. And at first they were not into it. This was not their thing. But I think they very quickly realized that the woodlands offered a lot more protection and a form of resistance. And so they actually ended up really embracing the chestnut culture and kind of making it their own and using it as a way of not conforming to what the colonial leaders were trying to force them to do. And I went to Corsica a few years ago, and it was really interesting to see that the chestnut system it's really in decline there as older islanders, kind of pass on and younger people aren't taking it up as much. But there still is definitely this sense of wanting independence and defiance, and the chestnut still seem to be a bit of a symbol of that. And that's, it's been hundreds of years now. So it was pretty cool to see that. And there was, chestnut fed pigs everywhere, and all of these pork products, sausages, and they were delicious.
I heard that I think it was French invaders, I'm not 100% sure, but they were really angry and fed up with the Corsicans, and they were calling them like, oh, those lazy farming people, because like they don't have to work that much and they have all that food. We really can't conquer them because they're like super safe on their island. I was like, yeah, go
I
chestnuts.
know. Yeah. Well, and actually, that's a really common refrain everywhere that, colonial leaders have tried to come in and take over the land or the political system of an indigenous population that has been based in these tree foods. They have had a very hard time because they are so abundant. And in the US, there's these really interesting accounts from the 1850s when Euro-American colonizers are moving west into, California area. And they're on the one hand saying, these people are lazy. They don't know anything about growing food. They just sit around all day. And then often in the same description, it's like, this is a land of incredible abundance. We've never seen so much food. And it's like, it's just amazing to see someone hold these two, from my perspective, clearly very conflicting perspectives. Like, well, it seems obvious that it's amazing and abundant because these people are caring for it in a way that's making it amazing and abundant. But through that colonial lens and with such like a heavy lens of racism and, dehumanizing these populations, they either refused to see or could not see the ways that it was indigenous tending techniques that were creating this abundance. But it's everywhere you look in the colonial history, it's always lazy. If they're not working, if they're not sweating for their food in the fields, in row crops, then you're lazy and you've got to get in on this other fun game, apparently, which is sweating and having a terrible time while growing your food.
Yeah.
Which
Clear
it's
cuts the hell out of it and start
yeah,
plowing. God damn it.
yeah. Yeah, and there are a few accounts that are kind of funny where there's like a Euro-American person saying like, I don't really get it. Our people prefer this horrible work and there's all this much easier food to grow on these trees. But if you look, that kind of goes all the way back to the Bible. There's some passages in the Bible about, leaving the Garden of Eden and being kicked out and being forced into sort of tilling and growing these dusty fields instead as a punishment. And there's a lot to unpack there, but it's pretty interesting how culturally embedded some of those ideas are.
Yeah, some of these stories are where basically the Garden of Eden was a freaking food forest.
Yeah, yeah.
And
There's
I think it's very interesting if you talk about colonizing people. It's much easier to colonize people and have them work and toil very hard than when you have people who are just like, I have abundance, we have all these trees, we just care for it and it gives us things. It's hard to control those people because they already kind of have everything. And if people are dependent on annuals, then it's like this cycle that if you then, as a ruler, prevent them to do certain stuff, they won't have any food, so they really keep them in their hands. So maybe it's an interesting idea to also tell a story that to become more free today and to have a political freedom, we have to revert to some of these techniques.
Yeah, one of the growers who I spoke with for the book, kind of before I was putting all these pieces together, we were touring this food forest that a guy named John Hershey planted in Pennsylvania here in the 1920s. And there was kind of this moment in the US in the 1920s around the Great Depression where the government actually saw these perennial nut and fruit trees as a solution to a lot of environmental and economic problems. And so there's this really mature old stand of fruit and nut trees in Pennsylvania that this guy named John Hershey planted. Now they're like, outside of a suburban nail salon and behind a church. They've kind of gotten lost. But my guide there, this man Dale Hendricks, said abundant ecosystems are what make free and healthy people possible. And it's just this statement that has stuck with me because it's so true. I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg. Like, are you free and happy first and then you make an abundant ecosystem, or you make the abundant ecosystem and that enables people to be free and happy? I don't necessarily know, but I do know that it's a really important part of the work.
Can you repeat that one sentence one more time? Because I think it's so powerful.
He said,
abundant ecosystem.
He said, diverse, abundant ecosystems make free people and happy people possible, or free people and healthy people possible. And it's true. You can't really have one without the other. And I think, people can get really wrapped up in this futuristic talk, like you were mentioning earlier, like by 2050, 80% of the population will live in cities and this and that. But I personally think that's the opposite of the direction that we need to be going. I think we need to be reconnecting with our ecosystems on the local scale and understanding, what they can handle in terms of waste and what they can produce if we care for them. So, yeah, I don't see it going that direction. I think that that's another way of sort of talking as though the future's already been decided, and it hasn't. We're deciding it every day.
80% of the population is going back to the land by the end of the 2100s.
Yeah, we're just going to start saying it.
Yeah, we're just going
Why
to start
not?
saying it in every
Nobody knows what's
conversation.
going to happen.
That's
I
true.
like it. I just keep repeating it, and people will believe it and think, oh, well, I guess it's time. I better go back to the land.
Yeah. Arthur Young, he showed us how to do it. Now we just have to redo it, but in another way. Beautiful. How do people react when you talk about chestnuts, acorns, hazelnuts, and other perennial staples as the future of food? What's their first reaction?
They're either like, huh? Or they kind of already know a little bit and they're excited. But I actually have been kind of surprised how many people are just enthusiastic and say, okay, yeah, tell me more. I think that people are fed up with the system the way it is and are interested in alternatives. And, every now and then you get like a real skeptic, but there's so much enthusiasm for any kind of connection that we can rebuild with these trees. I think that people kind of naturally gravitate toward trees. And so this idea that, we can do something for them either by burning or some other way of creating habitat, and also they're going to feed us, it seems to spark a lot of joy in people. Yeah. There are a lot of questions, I will say, about acorn processing. That's the second thing that usually happens.
But isn't it poisonous acorns?
No,
How do you
but
how do you how how do you do that? Remove the tannins.
yeah, well, so
All that
usually
stuff.
first I have to explain to people what a tannin is. And tannins are also in olives, right? So we have this other major global food, olives, that if you try to eat it straight off the tree, they taste disgusting. And
It's horrible.
probably more Europeans know that than Americans, because we don't have olive trees here. So a lot of people haven't had that experience, but it's the same with an acorn, and the tannins are water soluble. So you need to run water through the acorn nuts in order to remove those tannins. And then the acorn becomes sweet, just like any other nut. That bitterness is not left. And we have lots of ways of doing that, either just with water or with water and lye, which is a really old food processing technique. It might sound a little scary because lye can be caustic,
Water
but
and
that's
what?
used with olives. Lye, yeah, which I think sometimes people
What is lye?
might call lime. It's made from wood ash.
Oh, lime. Okay, I
Yeah,
misheard.
I think we have to, no, we call it lye here, but I think in Europe it may be called lime. So it pulls the tannins out much faster. So it accelerates the processing. And it's also used in traditional corn nixtamalization, and it's used with olives to debitter olives. So it's a very, very old technology.
Yeah. And one question you do hear a lot is that if you have an acre of chestnuts, for example, in the most natural way, or an acre of cereals in the most natural way, even an agroecological way, you do get more calories and nutrition from the cereals than from the chestnuts. How do you deal with those kind of questions and statements?
Well, so it depends on the time frame you're looking at, right? If you're just looking at 1 year, that might be true. But if you're looking at those pieces of land over time, you're going to need inputs from other areas of land in order to keep supporting that cereal crop over time. You're going to need fertility coming from somewhere else, because each year that you're harvesting, you're taking that fertility out of the soil, and eventually you're going to exhaust the soil and it won't be as productive, right? Whereas the chestnut acreage, you are building soil fertility every year. The tree is putting more and more carbon into the ground. And I think some pieces of land are better suited for cereal production and some pieces of land are better suited for tree crops. I don't think it has to be an either or, but I do think that over time, with that annual production in a lot of systems, you are going to start needing fertility from other pieces of land, and then you are going to have to start including that land in your productivity calculations. And I think
Calculation.
more than anything, that's just an argument for optimizing our choices about where we're growing certain things. In flat valley bottom lands, maybe that's a great place to grow grains over time because the river floods occasionally and it's bringing fertility back to that soil. But we are currently forcing grain farming on a lot of land where it does not make any sense, and where tree crops or some sort of silvopasture integrating animals into the system would make a lot more sense. And so I think what I'm arguing for is that instead of thinking, okay, how can we grow food on as little land as possible and then protect the other places as sort of nature preserves, I would say that I think the question should be more like, well, how do we produce food in a way that we're not degrading the land, we're actually making it even healthier. And so we're not thinking, oh, we're trying to limit this to the smallest area possible, because we're actually restoring habitat and building healthy ecosystems through this food production.
Yeah, this entire land sharing versus land sparing discussion, which of course, if you look ecologically, it makes a lot of sense to make farming more natural. I have seen farms where they grow cereals without importing a single gram of fertilizers, and they just grew the fertility on site itself. And they did have higher yields than chestnuts. But it's like you said, it depends where you are, which situation. And also it's not an or situation, it's an and/or situation. You can have chestnuts and cereals on the same plots. If perennial food forests become mainstream over the next 10 years, how would farms, diets, and communities look like?
That's something I think about a lot, because I have been trying to shift in my own home to, shifting some of our staple things to include more nuts. And I think that we don't totally know. I mean, we have examples of places, right? Like in Northern California, where I spent some time, it's said that historically this sort of acorn soup, they call it, was a mainstay of the diet. So kind of like oatmeal or polenta or cream of wheat, sort of like that, like an acorn mush. And so I think that in a lot of examples, the foods are actually quite familiar. They're just made with a different ingredient. So that's one example of, yes, we've never had acorn soup, but I think that if you were served it, you would say, this is a hot breakfast cereal, and I understand what this is. And then in other instances, there's sort of different foods that we don't really know yet. One that's coming to mind is one that was described to me in the area of Switzerland that I was in. They would take these dried chestnuts and boil them. And I kept sort of trying to compare it to something. Is it like mashed potatoes? Is it like, I don't know, like a porridge? And there, it was always sort of like, not quite, it's sort of like this, sort of like that, but they would eat it both savory
Something
and
new.
sweet. Yeah, something a little bit new. And I think that there's room for both of those things as we explore these tree nuts and what they can provide. The one thing that I've been experimenting with a lot is an acorn sourdough. So mixing wheat flour and acorn flour to create a sourdough loaf. And I'm actually in the process right now of trying to apply to get some funding to work with a friend who's a really expert sourdough baker, to sort of dial it in to a point where a recipe can be shared and is easily reproducible. But I think that, there's a lot of different opportunities to incorporate them into existing foods that we're very familiar with. And like I said, if we don't think of it as a either or, but okay, now we're using more of this and we're also still using a lot of traditional grains. How do we work together with them? What's the best, highest use? Where do the acorns or the chestnuts or the hazelnuts really shine? And we want to make those front and center. Whereas where do we want to sort of put them in the background? But either way, there's opportunities through flour, there's opportunities through oils. A lot of these nuts also produce really great oils, like hickories and hazelnuts and walnuts. There's all these beautiful oils, and also acorns, actually. Surprisingly, certain oak trees are higher in oil and they make a beautiful orange oil that's nutritionally really similar to olive oil. So that's kind of fun. And then there's also milks. So some of the nut species, there's like a hickory nut milk that I've had that people make. So there's surprises in there as well as some old staples, I think.
Yeah, and like you say, I've been to Route 9 Cooperative in United States,
Yeah.
not too far from Cleveland, and there I was treated on like an entire buffet of chestnuts pancakes, chestnuts bread, chestnut beer, chestnut donuts, chestnut croissants, chestnut everything. You can like make everything. Chestnut coffee, it's just incredible. And so these are all products that people know, and it's just like another way of making the same thing. And on the other hand, I know a famous chef from the Netherlands called Emil van der Staak, and he's been pioneering in all kind of tree-based specialties. Like he's making a brie cheese from almonds. He's making chocolate from
Wow.
chestnuts, which is incredible because it tastes just like chocolate. He makes foie gras from chestnuts. Chicken soup from the chicken soup tree, the Tuna sinensis. A lot of people know that one by now, but he uses the branches, not only the leaves. He uses the branches to make a broth. So it's such a rich world out there, and I think these stories of all these delicacies that can inspire people because everybody wants to have a good meal.
Of course. And I mean, when I was in Switzerland, I had a similar experience to what you had at Route 9 where, we went to this restaurant and it was chestnut season and the whole menu was chestnut based, whether it was the actual sort of, traditional grain type foods like gnocchi and pastas and desserts, but also there was wild game on the menu, and the wild game all came from the chestnut forests and was living on the chestnuts as well. So it's not just, when we think about it, we often just think about the direct nut foods, but there's also these indirect, you can raise a pig on chestnuts or acorns. You can
Yeah.
have cows living in the understory of an oak or chestnut savanna type ecosystem. In Switzerland, they also made so much yogurt and cheese from goats that were living on the mountains in the chestnut forest. So there's all different ways to incorporate these foods and the other species that can rely on these foods.
We always end the podcast by asking you a question which involves a magical wand. If you would, by any chance, find a magical wand, and you could literally do anything with it for yourself, for people around you, for the planet, for the people, what would you do with it?
I don't want to mess this up. I think
Great powers brings great responsibilities, they always say.
Yeah, this is tough, but without really knowing too much about what would happen afterwards, I think that I would get rid of the way our economic interest-based economy works, because I think that at the root of so many of our environmental problems is our capitalist system, which I think we need a new economic system to birth this new story and this new world. The food story that we live in now was birthed with our current economic system, and they go together and they go hand in hand. And so I would wave my magic wand and I would give birth to a new economic system that encouraged more life and more flourishing and stories of abundance.
Redefine the games, the economical games, and the rules of the game. Because if everybody has the same rule, we're on the same level. We can have a level playing field. Yeah, I think that's very much needed. Getting from the quarterly objectives to the 10-year objectives, which is all what perennials are about. It was really nice having you on the podcast, Elspeth. Really love the work you're doing and the book you've written. We're gonna include all your work and links to the book in the show notes. So if people want to go to foodforestpodcast.com, you will see links to all her work, to other podcasts, and to the designs we do and the courses we give. Thank you so much, Elspeth, for being here. And thank you, listener, and see you next episode.
Thank you for having me.